Repatriation, reconstruction, peace treaty, economic plan, resolutions are terms that we hear frequently on mainstream media to understand the dynamics of conflicts. We hear of a refugee plan, of migration policies, but we tend to forget the story of individual refugees, their struggle, their aspirations, their worries. We hear of truce, but we tend to forget the broken families and individuals who are carrying the scars of the body and the soul. We hear of the impact of the war on countries, yet with all of this, we miss the story. Our guest today is a storyteller. He found his way to share with us stories of human suffering from, between quotation mark, the legacy of war. Giles Dulay, welcome to MENA on the Map. I'm so happy to have you joining us in this interview. Knowing you on a personal level and knowing the type of trouble that you actually run after, I do not think that our next 30-40 minutes would be enough to cover the whole story. I'm so happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. It's kind of a strange time where I can't travel at the moment because of the current crisis. So this is the closest I can get to Lebanon, but at least that means I feel a little bit connected to you today.
Thank you, Giles. In my turn, I would like also to welcome you on MENA on the Map. It is such an honor having you with us today. If I had to summarize your resume in few words, I would say an expression of human existence. Giles, you were looking for stories of war victims and refugees between Europe, Middle East, and Africa. But it is very important to mention that in 2011, you became the story. After living a rock and roll life as a fashion photographer, you moved to war photography in 2011. While working in Afghanistan, you stepped on a landmine and you lost 2 legs and 1 arm. I would like to start with this first question. Through your photography, you tell stories to redirect perceptions and humanize the discourse. What has changed in Gilles' life, perceptions, and work culture after becoming yourself the story?
Well, I think the first important thing to say is the reason I got injured is because of these stories. I was already telling these stories, and I was in Afghanistan to tell the stories of civilians who have been injured in the conflict. Too much focus is always put on the stories of the soldiers, of the people fighting, and we barely hear the stories of the civilians caught up in conflict. And in most modern conflicts, it's 90% of the casualties are civilians. So I was in Afghanistan because of that passion, because I believed that was important. And I had what I call a very bad day at the office. As you say, I stepped on an IED, a landmine, lost both my legs and my arm. I spent the next 12 months in hospital, 46 days in intensive care, 37 operations. I went through a huge ordeal and was told I would never walk again, never work again. And really, it seemed like my life had been taken away from me. But I had one philosophy through that whole experience. And that was, I kept saying, I'm still a photographer. In here, I'm still a photographer. I still have one hand. I can find a way to work again. And in response to your question, a lot of people assume that the people I meet, I connect with them differently now because they see my injuries and they have similar injuries, and we can talk about that. But actually, it's not the injuries that connect us. In fact, many of my stories are focused on the experiences of women in conflict. Many of them have not actually been physically injured, but have suffered psychological harm and other issues. What they connect with is the suffering. The injury is one part of it. But the year of spending time in hospital, the suffering that caused, that really took my experience to a different level. And so when I meet people in Rwanda who survived the genocide, or I meet Syrians who have survived atrocities in the war there, or in DR Congo, all these places in the world, what unites them is so often somebody will say to me, I would not normally tell this story to anyone, but in your eyes, I see you have suffered like me. And so I trust you with my story. And so that really is the experience. That's what came from the adversity that I had. I was given an extra resilience, an extra focus, an extra strength, and a greater ability to connect on a very deep level with those who I document.
Do you think what happened had a message? What message did you learn from what happened with you?
On landmines. um, you know, it's a difficult thing. You know, it's as a photographer, you go to document people's suffering, and although you're there for the right reasons, although you're there because it's important to tell the stories, there's always an element where you feel guilty because you can take a photograph and then get on a plane and go home, and you leave the person still living that story. And I guess when I got injured, what it meant is that I really had quite literally walked in the footsteps of the people that I photographed, that I could no longer ever walk away from this work, that it had become part of my life. And, you know, I say that most days I get up and I'm in a lot of pain. It's very uncomfortable putting on prosthetic legs. There's a lot of physical pain. But every day that's like a reminder, because I think to myself, there is a kid, a child somewhere in the world who this day will get injured like me and will spend the rest of their life in the same pain that I'm in. So what it does is it kind of reminds me every morning of what's happening in the world and reminds me that I have to carry on telling those stories, because if my one hope is that one child doesn't have to go through what I go through because of my photography, then I feel I have done my job. So yeah, it's not something I would wish on nobody, but now I have to live with these injuries. I've tried to turn them into something positive.
Giles, as we speak now, we're seeing the photo of Samah, the Syrian refugee that you took a picture of, a portrait of in Jordan. And you wrote like an emotional message to her on Instagram when she died. And you said something, Samah allowing me to do her a portrait was a beautiful gift. You've covered refugee stories from Europe to the Middle East. What were the stories that inspired you the most? And what like came out of them? What are your aspirations to say, this is a story I would like to tell the world about?
You know, what I'm interested in is the little details of life, the moments of humanity. You know, too often when we see pictures of war, of refugees, they're dehumanized. They're seen as a mass of people pushing against fences, crossing rivers in destroyed cities, and we don't see them as people like ourselves. So what I'm always trying to find is those little moments of humanity that we can all relate to. So it could be a father doing maths on the floor, doing sums on the floor with his children, or a mother feeding her baby, a grandmother brushing a granddaughter's hair. So I'm always looking for those little moments that we can all relate to, that we can all say, that could be my son, that could be my wife, that could be my family. Because I want to show the shared humanity. Too many photographers want to show the differences between us. And I want to do the opposite. I want to remind everybody that once you're inside four walls, it doesn't matter if it's a mud hut in South Sudan, a tent in Jordan, or a flat in London. Within those walls, every family is the same hopes, the same dreams. And if we can see that connection, then I hope it creates empathy. But I want to tell you a little story about that photograph of Shamar, because one of the things that I think is really important is respecting the person whose story you're telling. A story is the most precious thing that we have. And I have to get the trust of somebody. And that story was actually amazing. I'd gone to near Zathri refugee camp in Jordan, but there was a smaller camp that was being used by nomadic people that didn't want to go in the main camp. And they were really struggling. They had no food. The shelter was very bad. It was a really bad situation. And when I turned up there, Shamar is the kind of matriarch of the community. And she came out and she was shaking her finger at me. Now, I've been to many, many war zones, but nobody has scared me more than Shamar. She was like right in my face like this. I was terrified of this woman in her 80s. But she said something very truthful. She said, we don't want a photographer here. We need help. We don't want our photographs taken. So I said, grandmother, I respect you. I will not take my camera out of the bag, but please just let me visit. So I spent the week just visiting and listening to stories and spending time with the families, getting to know what had happened to them and sharing food and just chatting. And at the end of 1 week, I was ready to start doing some portraits. And I have a white sheet that I travel with that is kind of a backdrop for a lot of my pictures. And I was busy putting it up. Now, in the week that I had been there, I had not spoken to Shamar anymore, but I'd seen her at the corner of my eyes every so often. I would see her in the corner watching me. So I was getting ready to do my portraits, and I turn around and she was stood in front of the sheet, ready for her portrait. Now, I never asked if I could do her portrait, but I'd earned her respect. And we use the phrase to take a photograph, and I take a photograph. I don't like that phrase. I think the greatest photographs are given to you. And what Shamar did in that moment was she gave me her portrait as a gift.
Amazing. Giles, as we were speaking about your photographs, I've been through skimming your pictures, and I saw some of them were graphic photos. They represent real like pain in these photos. You portray faces as they are. You are known for black and white photography. You tend to reflect uniqueness of every individual. Tell us, what is the path towards an expressive portrait, and what is needed to catch the moment besides letting the person give it to you as you just explained?
I think it's really important. Sometimes it's very difficult. I remember being in Mosul a couple of years ago where the fighting was very intense, and I was seeing children all around me injured, women, really terrible things. And it's very hard to sometimes think about your photography. I sometimes say then I'm shooting angry. I'm taking photographs when I'm angry, because you see this horror and you want the whole world to see. But I have to remind myself of my job. And I never want to take a photograph that anyone says it was so gruesome I had to look away. Because if somebody looks away, then I've not done my job. I need to connect people. So even when things are very gruesome and difficult and violent, I still think about the person. And I always say to a young photographer, don't photograph the injury, don't photograph the hospital, photograph the person still. You mentioned I started as a rock and roll photographer, and I photographed bands and musicians. Then I did some fashion, and now I move into the work that I do now. But in my heart, I've always been a portrait photographer. For whatever I do, I'm fascinated by people. I love people, and I'm curious about people. So even in a chaotic scene, in a hospital, in a war zone, with everybody running around, there's blood, there's screams, I still try and think about the person I photograph and connect with them when I do the photograph. And I think that helps people to see that. So what I would say to every young photographer or journalist is remember the person first, and then the injuries and the stories come later.
How did that impact your environment? Because you're coming from the West, shooting the atrocities in the Middle East. Did that create any sort of empathy within your environment?
My work has taken me to so many countries. Last year, I was in 19 countries in just 1 year.
Wow.
And, when I travel the world, I don't really see the difference between nations. I see people. And I've always said photography has been like a passport into other people's lives. For a moment, that camera lets people welcome me into their world as if I'm a friend, as if I'm a relative. And I think it's so important to be humble and to share in that experience. And I can honestly say, it doesn't matter where I've been in the world taking photographs. I've been welcomed and I've become part of that community for a while. And I think it's because people see that I'm there to tell their story. I'm there to help them to get their story across. I'm just an instrument for doing that. So I think trust is the most important thing. And because of that, I've always felt welcome in the places I've been.
Giles, you know that you're always welcome to Beirut to visit us. And I remember when we first met in 2012, I met you as a photojournalist. I was introduced to a photojournalist. And the person that I know now is a peace activist. You shift your photographic project from a journalism project into an activism project under the foundation that you founded, Legacy of War. Before you tell us more about this foundation and the work that you do, I'm interested in the choice of words. When we were preparing for this interview, I also said this. When I hear legacy, I hear a legacy of a person, of a thinker, of a philosopher. Why did you choose these terms, and what does the Legacy of War Foundation do?
It's interesting when you said that sort of description of legacy. And, the first point of Legacy of War was to remind people that war doesn't finish when a peace treaty is signed. The people who have suffered in wars, just because the war is officially over, People will spend their whole life psychologically, physically, through displacement. They will continue to suffer after a war is over. And we have to remember that. We have to remember that it's something that never leaves somebody. I had actually, funny enough, I had an email yesterday from a woman in America. And it was, I think, Veterans Day in America. And she wrote to me and she said she just heard my story and it had given her some comfort because her husband had been killed 57 years ago in Vietnam, and he'd had his legs blown off and he died. And she'd always thought he must have been in terrible pain. And then hearing me tell my story, she realized maybe he hadn't been. But it made me think that that widow still is suffering from a war that ended so long ago. And that's what I mean by the legacy of war, and that we should respect these people that have suffered, that become forgotten. And in some ways, you're right, that they should be almost on a pedestal, that we should remember the mothers, the widows, the children, all these people that continue to carry the cost of war for their whole lives. And we kind of put shoulders up on statues. But what about the civilians? What about the women? They also should be there, and their legacy must be remembered.
Can you tell us more about like what you're doing with now the foundation? What are the projects that you are working on?
I mean, it's very simple. You know, when I was in hospital, there were two groups of people. Some people would come up to me and they would say, hey, we'll find money so you don't have to work again. You know, we'll look after you. And I hated that. And then there's another group of people that said, how do we get you working again? How can we get you back out there? And that's what I wanted, was people to sort of find a way for me to work again. I didn't want charity. And that's what I want to offer, that opportunity to other people. So with my foundation, what we're trying to do is to enable people to empower themselves. We want to take down the barriers that are stopping them from reaching their possibilities. And because of conflict, maybe people have missed out on education, or they don't own land, or they've lost homes. If we can help them to get those things, then their life continues for themselves. So we're not a charity. We're like a support network. So in Lebanon, we support some Syrian refugee families. But again, we've managed to get them into housing, but we've also got them involved with the community. So the community as well is engaged with what's happening there. My favorite project is in Rwanda, where we have a project called Land for Women. And it's for women that survived the genocide. And we've set up cooperative farms, and then we give them the land. And then they run it themselves, and it's their project moving forward. Nice. So we do that. But one last thing, I just wanted to briefly say, you mentioned about becoming somebody who was a photojournalist who became more involved in peace activism. You know, there was a moment, if you think of it this way, if you were to look out of your window one day and down on the street, you saw somebody being killed, maybe by a knife or something violent happening, and you knew the person doing it, and you said nothing, people would look at you with shame and say, you need to speak out, you need to say something. Why is that any different? Because for me, I witnessed war, and I have seen children injured in front of me, dying in front of me, and I know who did it. So I can no longer stay silent. For me, I must speak out in the same way as if I saw my neighbor being killed. I have to speak out because I see who's also responsible, and it's not enough just to be witness anymore.
Amazing, thank you. As we speak, we are seeing the photography of a family in Mosul. As we are trying with this show to put MENA on the map, we would like to know your impressions from Mosul, an Iraqi city which story was the center of attention to all of us in the region, especially after the Islamic State invasion. What struck you the most? And knowing your approach, what inspired you the most in Iraq?
You know, Mosul was probably the worst thing I've witnessed in all my years of 15, 20 years of documenting conflicts. I had never seen anything like the destruction of Mosul. I was there during the fighting. I was on the outskirts of the city, in hospitals. It was beyond anything I'd ever seen. To see a wonderful city, a very modern city, absolutely destroyed, and the population just absolutely left in ruin, especially as they'd already suffered so much under the years of ISIS. But I also saw, like I do everywhere, real humanity. But I think, again, because I like to always tell the story through one family or one person, the photographs you're seeing of that family really sum up the suffering and the hope of the people of Mosul. I had been told about this house where some tragedies had happened and that I should visit and it would be a good place for me to go. So I arrived there, and the grandmother you see came to the door and she started screaming. She was almost frantic and just screaming her story at me. And I was like, grandmother, slow down. You don't need to tell me all this. But she was really frantic. And she was explaining that one day the father had gone on the roof to collect water and a drone missile had killed him. And then a couple of weeks later, the grandfather had been in a garden, the mortar shell landed, and he'd been killed in the garden. And then a day after that, the mother had been cooking in the kitchen when a sniper shot her. Their house had been on the front lines. And basically this whole family had been killed, apart from the grandmother and the children. And there was still blood on the floors. The house looked like a movie set, like a Tom Hanks war movie. You know, there was black walls, bullet holes in the windows. The fans were all melted down. It was really like a film. So she was screaming at me all these things about what had happened and the horrors. And I said, you don't need to tell me this. I know what happened. You don't need to keep repeating. Please just sit down. So she sat down on the sofa and I said, you know, all I ask is, can I cook with you? And she kind of went a bit confused and then just carried on and on. I said, no, grandmother, you have to listen. My grandmother was Italian. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us. So I need a new grandmother to teach me to cook. Wow. Will you teach me to cook? And she smiled for the first time. And it was like she relaxed suddenly. And she was very confused. I think she thought, why is there a one-armed guy come from the United Kingdom all the way to Mosul to cook with me? You know, we could still hear gunfire in the distance. We're near the front line. But it meant that she just relaxed. And I said, fine, I go now, I come back tomorrow. So we came back the next day with all I could find was this frozen chicken and some rice. It turned out she was the worst cook in the world. I mean, she was really, really bad. But we spent the day cooking together and the kids helped and there was laughter again in that house. And that's the wonder of food and stories. And then that evening when we sat down to eat, she said, I cannot eat with you. I have to eat in the other room because obviously they'd been under ISIS control and very strict. And I was like, grandmother, we eat together because we cook together. So she smiled and said, okay. And we ate together. And one of her sons walked in who hadn't seen her for a couple of months, and he burst into tears to see her enjoying food again, enjoying life again. And so for me, I may be a storyteller, I may be a photographer, but first I'm a human. And first thing is to build a relationship and a friendship with people. And what always inspires me is that wherever I go in the world, whoever I am with, when we sit and we eat together, there will always be laughter, there'll be stories. And from that, I believe there's always hope.
Jazz, you always talk about the power of food and the power of connecting with people with food, and the story of the grandma. We're also seeing the photo of the grandma now, like preparing the food. But why food is that important, especially in war zones? Because food is not a luxury there, it's a necessity. So what make you, how would you find the connection with human food, culture and sorrow?
You know, it's so important that you respect the people that you are photographing and whose stories you're telling. And I see many photographers, they just turn up, they take photographs and they leave. You know, often my camera does not come out of the bag the first day I'm there. You know, I always want to become friends with the people first. And for me, how do you become friends with someone? The difference between an acquaintance, somebody you know, and a friend is when we eat together. You know, it's how we celebrate in life. It's how we mourn in life. We share meals with our family. We share meals with our friends. It's such an important thing. And so when I travel somewhere and I sit with a family and we eat together, they see that I'm respecting them by sitting on the floor with them, my hand in with the food with them, sharing something. And for me, I think it's a real sign of saying that we respect each other. And yeah, all great friendships start with food. I remember our first meal that we went to Byblos and we ate the most amazing meal on the coast there. But I remember that because that's the first time we became friends. And it's the same with everybody I photograph. I remember the first meal I shared with them. And I think it's a sign of respect.
Well, we look forward for a second meal in Beirut anytime soon.
And by the way, he's a great cook as well. He posts his cookings on Instagram.
That's good. Giles, if you were to take your camera now as we speak and stand up and go to a region to shoot to take your photographs, which region would you choose and why?
I think it's funny because it means often thinking of the places I don't want to go to, but that's often where I have to go to. And there are many stories that are happening that we're not hearing enough about, and that's always what drives me. Is I hear of things happening in the world and I don't see those stories. And I don't think at the moment, I think a place that I would go to would be Yemen. I think that's a story that needs more attention than ever. The famine, the war, they are really devastated, but it's a story we don't hear enough of. So I think that's where I would go.
Jazz, before ending this interview, I would like to give you the floor to promote the call of artists that you launched a few weeks ago for artists to work with your stories and share them on the new platform of Legacy of War event. I really like the way I really like the caption that you had. There are no rules, no guidelines, simply respect the story.
That's the reason I take photographs. The reason I travel to all these places is because I want to create some kind of change for the people in those stories. And what's important is that the wider the audience, the more that people get to hear them and engage with them is great. So I created this thing called Vent, VENT, and you can find the website or the Instagram. And it's a platform where basically I have the stories, and then people can take those stories, artists, and they can destroy them. They can rip up the photographs. They can stick them back together. They can paint on them. They can write a piece of music. They can write a poem inspired by those stories. And that means that story has a new life and it gets shared with more people. And so that's what I mean when I say, don't respect my photograph, but respect the story, because that's what's important. And also, one of the things that I'm really excited about is I have some artists. I have an artist from Libya. She's an amazing young artist there. I have a friend from Syria who's doing music. And I think it's also really important that some of the people from the places where those stories come from engage with it as well, because I don't like this idea of me being a Western photographer doing it my way and just a Western audience. This is all about collaboration. It's all about stories. So it's really exciting for me that the stories I've done from some of the countries, artists in those countries are now creating new work from those stories and my photographs. So it's a place where art comes to life and reminds us that art can change the world.
Before ending the interview, I have a few questions from the audience actually coming to. They would like to know. We have a question from our regional director, Dirk Kunze, asking you what you can say about your self-determination with all these wars, the misery and difficulties. What is making you going?
It's funny because I think a lot of people think of that, and obviously I wouldn't go if it didn't upset me. I wouldn't go if it didn't make me angry. I can't sit at home knowing what's going on in the world and thinking I'm not doing anything about it. But at the same time, what I would say is, people call me a war photographer, but I'm not a war photographer because you'll never see a picture of a gun. You'll never see a picture of a soldier, a tank, or a plane. I photograph love. I photograph, if you look at all my photographs, it's people, couples holding hands, families together, people laughing, people sharing food. So actually, yes, I go to some really, really heartbreaking places. But what do I find in those heartbreaking places? I find the greatest humanity, and I'm reminded that love can never be destroyed.
Amazing.
Also, another question from a regular viewer of our show. His name is George Belidis, and he comes from Greece. And he points out the issue of COVID-19. What about the hundreds of refugees stuck at the European borders? Are there hope? What action should be taken? And here also I would like to take the opportunity to ask you about the project that you had, like you were taking photographs of like another type of war in British hospitals with other types of war fighters who are like from the medical body. What do you have to say on that?
COVID-19 is a global crisis that needs global solutions. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where we are lacking those leaders. what the world needs right now is global leadership. It needs people who have strength and focus to come together to find solutions that will affect us all. Because at the moment, it's being done differently by different countries. There's no global end goal. And I think it's very difficult because in our own countries, like in my country, in the United Kingdom, we are working to protect our most vulnerable. But we must remember that the most vulnerable in the world, people such as refugees or those living in other humanitarian crises, will still be the most vulnerable. And we mustn't forget them when we're so focused on our own crisis and our own situation. Because as I say, this will only be solved when we work globally together. And yeah, what's happening on some of the borders where refugees are being held and in the camps is something that needs to be resolved. But as I say, that will only happen when there is global leadership.
Giles, you inspire us with your stories and with your ongoing activities on all levels. It has been a great honor for me and for Yara having you with us on MENA on the Map, and we look forward to highlight your future activities with us, and maybe one day we can do it live.
Yeah, and I look forward to sharing a wonderful meal in Beirut soon.
Definitely. Since 2012, we've managed actually to meet, and I hope that at some point you join our endeavor as well at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and fighting for free thought and for peace. Thank you so much, Giles.
Thank you.
And hope to see you soon.
Goodbye.